Well, as we've just seen, Julia Gillard's proposed new tax on carbon dominated political debate today. To discuss the issue, I was joined a short time ago by Finance Minister and former Minister for Climate Change, Penny Wong, from our Canberra studio, and from Melbourne, Greg Hunt, the opposition spokesman for climate action and the environment. Penny Wong and Greg Hunt, welcome to Lateline.
Good to be with
you.
Good
evening.
Penny Wong, have you got a problem selling this carbon tax? You start behind the eight ball because of a promise your Prime Minister made on the eve of the last election.
Julia Gillard and the Labor Party went to the last election being very clear about our view on climate change. We believe it's real and we believe human beings are contributing to it, and we have said for a number of years that the most efficient way of dealing with climate change is to price carbon through a market mechanism. What did Julia announce this week? A market mechanism to price carbon.
But you can't get much clearer than there'll be no carbon tax under a government I lead.
And Julia did make very clear her view on climate change, which is as I've outlined. Climate change is real, human beings are contributing to it, and we need to price carbon, and that's what we've announced. But can I say, look, I don't think anybody who went through the last Parliament could doubt Labor's intention to act on climate change. We have a Parliament now that is willing to act on climate change. That's what the Australian people voted for, and most of all, it's what's in Australia's national interests. And
but
we do actually have to
literally on that statement, it is a broken promise, isn't it? Is that so hard to come to? It's a very clear statement. There was no qualification. She didn't say unless it's a hung parliament, unless the Greens have got the balance of power.
Well, look, there's going to be a lot of debate about a lot of things about this issue, but you know what is the most important thing, and that is that this nation does something about this enormous policy problem. And we are saying, as a government, we're not going to walk away from this. This is, as you started off with, a very tough debate for the government and a tough debate for the nation, particularly when we're faced by an opposition that's simply going to seek again to wreak action on climate change, but it is the right thing to do for the future of the country.
Greg Hunt, a tough debate for the opposition. How many in the Liberal Party actually want a price on carbon? Because, of course, your former leader actually negotiated just such a thing.
There is extraordinary strength in the position which will have us fight against this issue. And the reason we want to fight against it is because, firstly, an election is about a mandate, and as you've just said, the Prime Minister expressly ruled out this policy of a carbon tax on the eve of the election and expressly said that no government that she would lead would have a carbon tax in the week of the election. She thought this was of sufficient magnitude and importance to expressly and clearly rule it out. So we are very unified, but let me make this point. The reason beyond the mandate why this is important is because it will have a real and profound human impact of $300 per household immediately per annum in terms of electricity, 6.5 cents per litre in terms of petrol, and all when there's a much better, cheaper way.
I want to ask you what you're basing your numbers on in a minute, but just to go back to that point of expressly ruling out such a policy, Penny Wong, a very simple question. I go back to it. The Prime Minister did expressly rule out a tax, did she not? Am I reading it wrong? Did I hear it wrong?
Yeah, and we can get into a semantic debate.
But it's actually, it's not what's semantics. There's no semantics. There'll be no carbon tax under a government I lead. I'm just wondering why it's so hard to recognise she said that and now there has been a change of plan.
We have said all along we want a price on carbon through a market mechanism. We have announced a price on carbon through a market mechanism. It is true, and the Prime Minister has acknowledged this, that for the first number of years we have said we propose that it will be a fixed price. She has said this would operate like a tax. But let's think about what sort of debate we want in this country. Are we really going to have that argument, or are we going to have the argument about what's right for the nation at a time where there is a Parliament which was voted for by the Australian people, which wants to act on climate change? That's what the Australian people voted for. And can I say on Greg Hunt, I mean, for Greg to lecture us about inconsistency on this is rather extraordinary. This is a man who wrote his thesis entitled "A Tax to Make the Polluter Pay," a man who supported Malcolm Turnbull, supported John Howard's plan for an emissions trading scheme and a price on carbon, and now all of a sudden is running around saying the sky will fall in if we put a price on carbon.
Greg Hunt?
Right. The answer is very clear here, that we have set out a position which is that there is a better way, using a market mechanism, which is the same way that we buy back water, we would buy back pollution, we would buy back carbon, and that would cost dramatically less than the government. But much more importantly, we went to the election on that policy. We went to the election on that policy, not on a grand deception. And what is, I think, critical here, Ali, is that this was so significant that the Prime Minister had to rule it out as her last pitch to the Australian public. And that's why there's a grand deception, and that's why there's public anger, coupled with the concern about $300 of electricity prices. So I'm not going to be lectured by Penny Wong.
Where did that $300 come from? What price are you working on?
That's a carbon price of $26 per tonne, as was set out in the Australian Industry Group report this week. But it's also very similar to the figures which were set out by the then Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, on the 3rd of February in the Parliament last year, by the New South Wales independent regulator in the final report on pricing of electricity if there's an increase through a carbon price or carbon tax of March of last year. The Business Council said the same thing, and so there is absolutely clear statistics here that $26, which is what you'll need if you're going to use their mechanism, at the very least, will have a $300 price impact on electricity.
Penny Wong, let me interrupt you there.
On petrol.
$26 a tonne, anything less, would you actually be able to make the change that this is designed to do?
Well, I do want to answer that. I want to respond to one thing Greg said. First, he talks about his policy. The advice was released in the incoming government brief. The advice has been released previously. It's not a policy that works, so let's make that clear. In terms of the carbon price, what we see again from Mr Hunt tonight is the same old, same old. He's making figures up in terms of and trying to assert those as government policy. We've not yet announced the carbon price. You know that. He knows that, and I think your viewers know that.
But do you need at least $26 a tonne, as most in business do say?
We will have to announce that, but what we will have to do first is work through this process of dialogue within the Parliament, through the multi-party committee, and within the community. And so we have been clear about the fact that what we have announced is only the first part in a range of decisions the government has to make. The price is one of those, as is assistance to households. That is the thing in this attempt of a scare campaign that the opposition is running that they never speak of.
Well, let me clarify one issue on that. Is petrol part of this scheme?
Look, we've announced a broad mechanism. We've talked about sectoral different sectors that could be covered. But yes, those are decisions that still have to be made.
So you don't, at this point, petrol's up in the air, is that right?
At this point, what we have said is we want to move to a market mechanism. We want to start with a fixed price for a period of 3 to 5 years. We want to start on July 2012. And these are the range of sets of decisions that we need to make. Now, this is a big. I know this is a big policy. I spent a number of years working in this area, and so did Greg.
So let Greg just speak on that point. You want to speak about the transport point?
Exactly. Firstly, I think we need all to be honest and just call a carbon tax a carbon tax. But secondly, today, Adam Bant said on Sky Television that he was delighted with the agreement that transport fuels, which means petrol, are in. And so he regards it as an agreement that petrol is in.
Penny Wong?
Oh, well, as I said, the paper speaks for itself. There's a discussion about a range of sectors that would be covered. It's true that transport is amongst those, but we have also said these are still decisions yet to be finalised. I know that Greg wants very quickly... Well, I know
AAA today said it was a betrayal.
Greg, you know, it is really quite sad that someone like you, who used to want to take action on climate change, who was so strong in support of Malcolm Turnbull, now because Tony Abbott is your leader, is arguing precisely the opposite of what you have spent most of your life arguing, because you do know this is the right thing to do.
Ali, may I intervene here? Firstly, I think we are very clear that we are passionate about real action, but not through this mechanism. Everybody knows we've designed an alternative mechanism which is modelled on the most successful system in Australia and arguably the Southern Hemisphere, New South Wales. It's cheaper, it's more effective, it's more efficient, it's working and it's operating.
Well, Greg, let me ask you about your alternative, because this does go to the heart of what you're saying. Just this week, the Department of Climate Change and Energy Efficiency, in fact, not this week, it was earlier this month, they released a new report that showed that by 2020, emissions are projected to be 24% above 2000 levels. Now, you and the government have committed to at least 5% below 2000 levels. Now, how do you get to how do you avoid 24% above 2000 levels and get to 5% below by 2020 without a price on carbon?
Oh, very simply. That's an abatement challenge of 160 million tonnes. What does that mean for people who aren't familiar with this space? It means we've got to reduce the amount of emissions by about 160 million tonnes. How do we do that? We go and do real things and we purchase the lowest cost emissions reduction in the economy. And we go and do that by creating a market, just as you buy back water, which the government and almost everybody supports. You buy back the lowest cost emissions, and it happens in many places, and most significantly, it leads to real things: planting of trees, capturing of carbon in soils, cleaning up of power stations, cleaning up of waste coal mine gas. Real things where every dollar goes to reducing emissions, and it doesn't involve about $114 billion of tax raising in the form of electricity and petrol prices.
Let's just make a figure up. Well, he just made that figure up again. Well, that is a figure you've just again plucked out of the air, Greg. But can I say this? Do you know the only? I listened to you in silence, Greg. The only person who believes that his policy will work is Greg. He's the only person. Treasury doesn't believe it. The Department of Climate Change doesn't believe it. But more importantly, can I finish, Greg, please? But more importantly, Tony Abbott doesn't believe it, because Tony Abbott doesn't care whether it works or not. He says that climate change is absolute crap. I apologise, they're the words he used. That's what he thinks. So he doesn't care if this policy works. The only person who believes this policy will actually work is Greg Hunt. No one else does.
Penny Wong, when it comes to compensation, are you going to be using the same arrangements as were proposed under the ETS? Because, of course, Bob Brown has described those compensation arrangements as a polluter's payday. So how do you find the middle ground, given that the Prime Minister seems fairly in touch and committed to those previous arrangements? She said, it's not my intention to throw all of that work out the door.
And that's not her intention, but neither is it our intention to not have the discussion about how to get this through the Parliament. This is a discussion that has to be had between the government, the independents and the Greens to try and build this broad consensus on this issue. And assistance to industry is one of the issues that is going to be a very tough discussion. We're not walking away from that.
Greg Hunt, if this gets through Parliament, will the Coalition repeal it should they win government?
Well, we don't believe it will. The government has already twice expressed their absolute commitment and twice walked away. Firstly, they deferred the absolute fixed 2010 date.
It's not a game.
Firstly, they deferred the absolute fixed 2010 date, and then secondly, at the end of April of last year, they dumped the entire system. Then you go on to the fact that there was an ironclad pledge of no carbon tax. So we don't think this is
but let's say it does get through Parliament.
Done deal.
Would you repeal it?
We'll deal with those issues if that ever happens, but we don't believe that is likely to happen. The history is that the government makes bold pronouncements and then walks away from them. I only have to mention
the history is
the
that
home
the
insulation
opposition
program,
seeks
which
to
was
wreck this reform.
absolutely brilliant until the day it was jumped.
Let me ask you, Penny Wong, because of course this is very important and as significant a reform as the government argues it is. If you have trouble getting it through Parliament, and indeed it has to be said, Tony Windsor has felt compelled to clarify his comments. He says there is no carbon tax. What you've got basically is a proposal in regard to a framework that will lead to community debate. If you can't get it through, will you go to an election over this?
Oh, well, look, we believe we can get it through. And we are willing to have this debate. We are willing to have these negotiations within the Parliament, and we are willing to have this debate in the community. Because what we know is we have Mr Abbott, aided by Mr Hunt and others, wanting to wreck this reform, but we absolutely know this is in the interests of the nation and in terms of particularly the future of the nation. So we're going to have this debate. It'll be a tough debate, but we can win this debate.
Can they win it, Greg Hunt?
Well, we believe that the government should chance their hand. They should take this issue to seek a mandate at an election. We took the GST to an election. We took that risk. This policy has no mandate because it was expressly ruled out. And I have a very simple question. Will you take it to an election to seek a mandate, and why was it ruled out prior to the last election?
And that's a question that could keep us going for a very long time, and we don't have that time. So I will say, Penny Wong and Greg Hunt, many thanks for talking to Lateline tonight.
Good to be with you.